First of all, I want to start with my presentation of a story that inspired me for making this paper. I have recently attended a public lecture where a renowned scholar expressed his opinion about the recent shift to prioritize the history of ordinary people and undermine the elite's history. He believed that it has gone too far, and also he stressed that the top-down approach is more reliable in the history from below and more effective in explaining the past than the grassroots perspective. So, because in my dissertation I'm doing mostly the history of ordinary people, this episode inspired me to stand in defense of the history from below. And in my paper, I will demonstrate that in some cases the top-down approach bears little reliability. So ordinary people, they do have agency and are legitimate makers of history. So, for instance, then Jewish mass migration started back in 1881. Jewish immigrants, the majority of whom were extremely poor, didn't have proper travel documents, and the entire movement was chaotic and lacked a certain organizational force. Only 10 years later, Jewish intellectuals, journalists, and philanthropists started seriously analyzing and evaluating this complex phenomenon. So, Jewish intelligentsia in Russia and abroad was urged to help Russian Jewish immigrants with unsurmountable difficulties that they encountered on their way to new countries. And the elites felt an obligation to caution the resettlers, to warn them about the possible consequences of illegal border crossing and poorly planned relocation. So, to make this chaotic people's movement more systematized, American and British philanthropists summoned commissions to study immigration from the Russian Empire and developed a plan for a more organized resettlement. So foreign benefactors they had their own view on the future Russian Jews, which they paternalistically imposed on their East European brethren. So ideally, Russian Jews had to go through the process of normalization, in quotation marks, from the feminine type of unproductive Torah scholars and peddlers to the masculine and productive farmers. Promotion of agricultural colonies was a part of the larger theory of muscular Judaism proposed by Zionism, Marx Nordau, at the end of the 19th century. And this new philosophy underlined the need to reform Jews from engaging them in physical labor that would erase their feminine qualities, again feminine in quotation marks, to connect them to the land and therefore normalized, again in quotation marks. The philanthropists envisioned the completion of this transformation of Russian Jews outside of Russia. Therefore, according to this perspective, Russian Jewish immigrants had to fulfill benefactors' expectations and comply with the outsider's view. The realization of this new initiative was supposed to be enacted through immigration organizations established abroad and then transplanted to the Russian Empire. And for the time limit, I will concentrate on the two most active and influential immigration agencies, the Jewish Colonization Association and the Kiev Jewish Immigration Society. Both of these organizations were founded in the United Kingdom and promoted establishment of agricultural colonies of Russian Jews in the Americas. The Jewish Colonization Association was established in London by a great philanthropist, Baron Marius de Hirsch, and became officially recognized in the Russian Empire as an organization for Jewish immigration in 1892. The Jewish Immigration Society shared another ideology, the territorialist ideology of Israel Zangwill, and was approved by the Russian government years later in 1909. But these organizations, they had lots of similarities. So both of them tried to direct immigrants' movement to other places than the overcrowded New York, the traditional place of entering to the United States. And even though the Jewish Colonization Association prioritized Jewish resettlement to Argentina, They also supported a number of colonies in the United States. But unlike the previous organization, the Jewish Immigration Society fought the port of Galveston in Texas to be their new Russian Jewish homeland. Both of these organizations were quite successful in securing support of imperial authorities, and these immigration agencies basically got the right to lobby Jewish immigrants' interests. They could spread the appeal among the Jewish population, the call for immigration. They could help them to obtain free exit permits from the government, and also they were able to get some subsidies for cheaper transportation of immigrants and their luggage through the territory of the Russian Empire. So basically, these two organizations were responsible for the organized border crossing and smooth relocation of Jewish immigrants to their destination points. And so, in my work, I have seen that both of these organizations were quite active in their attempt to recruit potential immigrants. So, besides the main office of Jewish Colonization Association in St. Petersburg and the main office of Jewish Immigration Society in Kiev, both of these organizations had several hundred local offices or representatives across the entire Pale of Settlement and the Kingdom of Poland. And those representatives, they promoted immigration as hard as they could by recruiting posters in synagogues and houses of prayer, by sending recognized public Jewish figures to small Jewish shtetls, and they even offered free medical checkups for the potential immigrants. However, even though these organizations were really eager to help the immigration case and fulfill expectations of foreign philanthropists, they soon have realized that all their efforts were basically in vain. And as an example, I want to cite one representative of Jewish Colonization Association in Kherson Gubernia, somebody by the name Magin, who reported to the Central Committee of Jewish Colonization Association that he noticed that he practically had nothing to do in the area where he was supposed to do his promotion, his recruitment work. Even though he publicly announced that he was ready to consult on the questions of immigrations, and he was able to do it free of charge, he kept putting posters in local synagogues, but still ordinary Jews continued to travel using their own resources. Likewise, outside of the big cities, the local representatives of Jewish Colonization Associations were practically the only subscribers of the bi-weekly immigration journal of this organization, which was called the Jüdische Emigrant. This journal was aimed to spread, again, useful information about immigration, to give practical advice that might help immigrants on their way to the new country. However, representatives of this organization, they again admitted that potential immigrants preferred to get information by the word of mouth or from Yiddish daily press. So almost nobody wanted to pay subscription for a paper that discussed only the general issues of immigration. So I will quote another representative of Jewish Colonization Association, somebody by the name Chaim Levin from a small Belarusian shtetl Yanovo, who noticed in 1913 that the Jüdische Emigrant could be of interest only to Jews who were about to leave, but such people a priori couldn't be regular subscribers of the journal because they're thinking of leaving now and they will leave soon, so they could not be regular subscribers by any means. So, as we have seen, despite the good intentions that the Jewish Immigration Association had, they failed to recruit a large number of Jewish immigrants. For example, during active years of Jewish Immigration Society, from 1907 till 1914, this organization managed to relocate only 8,000 Jewish immigrants to the port of Galveston. So that's 7 years, almost 8 years, and 8,000 Jewish immigrants, which was less than 1% of their entire Jewish population that left to the Americas during the period of mass migration. So this is practically nothing, and most likely these people would immigrate without the help from their Jewish Immigration Society. So that's a quite interesting question. Like, there are two big organizations which are offering free advice, which are helping in the immigration case, but somehow Jewish immigrants, ordinary people, basically rejecting their efforts to help somehow. In my presentation, in my paper, I propose why that was the case. So a closer examination of the immigration organization activities reveals why they failed to attract a large number of Russian Jewish immigrants, and why, consequently, almost 2 million Jews crossed Russia's border independently from this immigration philanthropic society. So I studied documents of these organizations available in the archives in Kiev, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and New York, and these are some explanations that I have to offer. So one of the reasons was that these organizations came to immigration business only when mass resettlement was already in full sway. Instead, illegal travel agents were right there when mass migration started in the wake of pogroms of 1881-1882. The professional smugglers, they help resettlers to cross the border illegally using smuggling networks that they developed long before Great Migration started. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so I have to drink water. Just bear with me 1 second. So basically, these illegal travel agents, human smugglers, they used networks, smuggling networks that they established long before immigration began, but this time humans replaced alcohol and goods as the main object of trafficking. Therefore, at the beginning, potential immigrants had no other option than to use services of underground travel agents in the case that they wanted to leave the Russian Empire. Some other reasons I find in the policies of these immigration societies, and they were quite selective when it concerned about the larger number of immigrants selecting whom they should help. So to ensure success of potential immigrants abroad, they preferred to work with young, healthy male professionals possessing some financial resources. So dealing with married applicants, immigration associations favored sending away their entire families because they tried to avoid leaving unproductive members of society behind, according to their Russian government's objectives. And as I said, they acted together with the Russian government, so they could not really do something against the Russian government in the practical organization of immigration. So since a quite usual pattern was the husband left first and then sent for his wife, children, and possibly parents, this added additional problems for those who wanted to immigrate legally through their official agencies. Therefore, official organizations' work was not so charitable as intended, but was a sort of business enterprise. They needed to make sure that everyone whom they sent abroad would be admitted to the new countries. And the Jewish Immigration Society was especially strict in this process of selecting immigrants. Besides quite understandable medical examination, which had a purpose of revealing if this immigrant had any disease that admitting countries were afraid of. These organizations put different sorts of discrimination in favor of this ideology of muscular Judaism. So first of all, they had an age limit. So everyone who was over 40 years old was rejected, since hopes were that immigrants would become useful and productive members of new societies. There was also a limit based on income. The official agencies were helping those Jews who could pay for their travel or whose relatives were already in America and could send a prepaid ship ticket. There was also a gender discrimination. So unaccompanied women were not considered for immigration by these official agencies because these organizations feared that such women were too vulnerable and could become victims of human trafficking. Finally, there was a discrimination based on the professional level, as I already hinted a little bit. So only those who had some skills, like tailors, craftsmen, and farmers, were assisted by the official agencies, again with the hopes that they would succeed in the countries of immigration. And of course, if those immigration agencies were legal and were acting through the legal channel, they were supposed to help Jewish immigrants to acquire travel documents, which meant passport or exit permits. But acquiring those documents through legal channels was a very lengthy procedure and required navigating many levels of bureaucracy. So potential immigrants... Oh, but we still have a little... Yeah, I'm like...
Try to keep on.
Yeah. So potential immigrants had to apply for travel documents far in advance and wait from several weeks to several months to get an official permission to travel. And then the authorities were checking carefully the applications to figure out if an immigrant owed a debt or unpaid fine for the government, which created additional complications. And then I was hinted that I don't have much time left, but I still want to say something. Okay, so I just mentioned the additional complications, so what those complications could be. So first of all, it was a fine of 300 rubles for evading the military service, and that was the most common kind of those fines. So, but then Great Migration started. Many young Jewish men were leaving the Russian Empire illegally, trying to escape the army or simply to find a better life abroad. So since their names were not removed from the imperial records of conscripts, the government imposed a fine on the remaining members of the immigrants' family. So then finally the authorities were checking the records and they found out that the family owed a debt, had to pay such fine. Most likely, the Russian authorities were forgiving such fine because they were trying to get rid of Jews, as I'm arguing in my dissertation. But this procedure still took quite a lot of time, and many potential immigrants didn't want to wait for so long. In addition, sometimes getting an official travel document was simply impossible because the Russian Empire had a phenomenon of dual rabbinate. There is a brilliant book by Sharon Fries about Jewish marriage and divorce, and she explains very vividly this ambiguous situation with spiritual and state rabbis. So basically the state rabbis had to keep records of Jewish births and deaths and marriages, but they didn't have any authority in Jewish communities. So sometimes families would just go to spiritual rabbi to perform Jewish rituals. Therefore, the real situation with the number of family members and things like that, very often it was different from the records that the Russian state had. Last but not least, after going through so many levels of bureaucracy and such a time-consuming procedure, immigrants had only 1 month to sell all their possessions. It was later extended to 3 months, but still it was like very short period of time to sell everything. So this is why the situation with immigration agencies was so complicated. But acting on their own, Russian Jewish immigrants did not depend on these numerous conditions that the official border crossing required. So ordinary Jews were making their way across the Atlantic Ocean for 10 years before the first immigration association emerged in the Russian Empire, and they continued doing so afterwards. So as I said, they used services of illegal human smugglers, and even though it was perfectly known to everyone that these illegal travel agents, they had a tendency to leave Jewish immigrants halfway, not taking them to the Americas as they promised. Still, it was easier to just apply for their services and not going through official bureaucratic procedures. I'm just trying to see how I can go directly to my conclusion. So as I said, that notwithstanding this wide network of lawful Jewish immigration association and the extensive propaganda activities, the majority of immigrants preferred to use services of illegal travel agents. And they were basically going through the trodden paths that their relatives and friends did before this immigration agencies came to even be in the Russian Empire. So with this example, I want to stress the importance of the history from below and how it might be more telling about the past than the history of elites. My protagonists, the ordinary Russian Jewish immigrants from late imperial Russia, were crossing the western border regardless of the grand plans that the elites envisioned for them. Then Jewish intelligentsia developed theory of muscular Judaism and proposed a plan of how to reform feminine Russian Jews. The later, so-called voted with their feet, made their own choices regarding the ways of border crossing and places of destination. So, not denying importance of intellectual history and the history of ideas, I nevertheless want to underline the agency of ordinary immigrants in the history making, especially in such historical events as mass migration. Thank you.
Дорогие коллеги, есть вопросы, комментарии на любом языке? Хорошо, тогда у меня вопрос, точнее их два вопроса. Первый, может быть, я не допонял, но вы сказали, что русские власти изначально поддерживали территориалистский проект Зангвиля. Как бы вы можете про это что-то сказать? Или...
Я такого не говорила.
Окей, но это прозвучало.
Нет, я имела, это был кусочек не про российское правительство, это был кусочек про то, что мне нужно вернуться именно в свой текст. Я просто упомянула, что существовало такое общество, и оно поддерживало идеологию Зангвиля, но российское правительство не разделяло, как бы сказать это лучше. Я видела очень много документов в архивах о том, что наоборот, общества эмиграционные, которые поддерживали территориалистические взгляды, они хотели основать, мне сложно переключаться. They wanted to establish their organizations in the Russian Empire, but then the Russian government was against and they made several attempts. So I saw documents when one organization is trying to apply to the Russian government to be legalized many times, and like imagine in different names. So the same organizations applied to the Russian government. I don't remember the name of this organization at this moment, but they tried several times. They applied to the Russian government, changing their names all the time, but every time they was rejected. And this Jewish Immigration Society, it was also, there was a very long story before the organization, this idea emerged, and then they were approved. There was quite a long period of time. So no, I didn't say that the Russian government supported the terrorist movement.
Okay. Yeah, because obviously a big part of the tutorials, they were also quite left-oriented. And Sangul was a British citizen, so. Okay, and then the second question I had, if there was any territorial pattern in how the organizations worked. So it's clear that their work, as we learned, was ineffective, extremely ineffective, but still can we say that in certain places it was more effective than in others?
Yeah, so it's one of my methodological challenges because I study primarily the immigration to the United States, and the Jewish Colonization Association, it helped Jews to immigrate to Argentina primarily. So that's one of my methodological challenges. And then again, it's also a big question how successful they were. For example, Jewish Immigration Society helped establishing Jewish settlements in Texas, in the port of Galveston. And I think even though the numbers were small, I think they made their accomplishments were quite significant if we're talking about this small group of people, like several thousand. But when we are talking about the overall migration movement, their work seems to me quite insignificant. So, and this.
Okay, but can we say that, let's say, in Podolia, government they were more effective than in Vitebsk or vice versa?
That's an interesting question. So I do have all documents, but I haven't studied these regional patterns yet. So this is a work that still has to be done. So far, I've been looking at just some general tendencies. But regional differences, I think they are really important. But this is something still to learn.
Okay. And one just important comment that among those who advertise their services were not only legal and illegal agents and so on, but of course also ship companies, at least if we speak of the period after 1906, when there was a direct steamship line to New York. There were brochures in Yiddish concerning immigration, promising safest travel to all possible destinations, both in North America and South America. So this was also important. These also was one of the players, which probably would be somewhere more reliable, definitely, than smugglers, and more and less oppressive than Jewish organizations with their programs, agendas, idea, and general probably willingness part of Russian Jewry to get finally away from the ever-present Jewish community. This is also important, that people were tired of being constantly bonded to the Jewish community.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to study representatives of shipping companies, but the question is archival sources, and so far I found very few. But I'm going to Odessa in 1 week, so hopefully I will be able to manage to find somewhere, to find something there. But I do agree that these actors were extremely important when we're talking about migration movement. And sometimes they also cooperated with illegal travel agents. So I do believe that they're important, but my problem is now sources, and I don't have enough sources to talk about those, this kind of agents.
Okay.
Just a small question. If I understand correctly, there was only one or a few American ports for entry, like Galveston, right? Or it was there was a list of such ports.
The prime port of entrance was Ellis Island, of course, but the goal of Jewish Immigration Association was to direct this immigration flow from overcrowded New York to elsewhere. And they found this solution, this port in Texas.
Okay.
So this port was not as big and not nearly as important as that. The idea was there are too many Jews in New York. We have to do something about it. Yeah.
Okay. That's essential.
Any other questions? Еще вопросы? Хорошо. Thank you.